Welcome to Be Lifted Up, your guide to living an abundant life. And today we're talking about faith, voting rights, and power. And my co-host, D. Marshall, I mean, every week I always say we have the best topic for D because D is really on this. But D, you really are on this conversation about voting rights, about engagement, and as a person of faith, that we need to be engaged in these conversations. But talk about what you see happening, particularly now, as we're back to fighting for something that many of us thought was a done deal that we'd already overcome. Talk about, again, the people you're working with, Melanie Campbell.
Yep.
I'm just such a big admirer of what you're doing in this space, when obviously you already have a business to run, your girlfriend's pray, but this is something you really been exhibiting a lot of passion around over the last couple of years.
Yeah. I'm excited that we're talking about it because I think some people want to know and some people just are not in the conversation. So when they do hear, they're like, oh, okay, thank you. And I think that's part of having everybody do their part. In other words, or civil rights and social justice organizations, they need to lead in the work and then engage us in a lot of ways. And so Melanie Campbell, who's the president and CEO of the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation, is one of those leaders. A lot of times when we see civil rights leaders leading, we'll see the four. We'll see NAACP, Derek Johnson. We'll see Mark Morial with NUL, and then we'll see Reverend Sharpton at National Action Network. But there's always a fourth. But the reason we don't see the fourth or hear about the fourth organization so much is, I think, because it's woman-led, and Melanie is just a foot soldier. She's a general, actually, boots on the ground, and she really is about the work. But in terms of just engaging, and let me just say this. So Melanie Campbell and the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation, civic engagement and social justice is her work and the work that they lead. But she also has an arm of NCBCP that is the Black Women's Roundtable. Baddest Black women on the planet are part of Black Women's Roundtable. And how I came to know, voting rights, and even, Alfred, to do some of the things that I do now was coming through the Black Women's Roundtable and then just leaning in a little further. So I'm excited that we get to talk about this, but just to frame this for a second. So my company, Diverse and Engage, we speak three languages. So leadership development, workplace culture, diversity work. Our clients we are tier one for probably 90% of our clients are corporate. But I have the privilege of working with Melanie Campbell. She's a client. We advise her on corporate diversity and inclusion and those connect points. And so we get to do some work with her that is largely some of the corporate work. So we're like a tier two supplier, you would say. And that is how I was able to lean in a little further and do work in this space and come to learn. Last year, in fact, in July, Melanie Campbell led, it was historic. Many people don't know, but she rallied Black women leaders to protest on behalf of voting rights. And it became a thing. It became, Black women leaders. And Melanie has a way of really mobilizing all of the Black women leaders. So not just Black women, but the leaders and from members of Congress. And believe it or not, on July 15th of last year, the first protest, and guess what happens? We go with bail money. That's how Melanie rolls. And with Congresswoman Joyce Beatty. And it was such a powerful a moment, but also a movement. And it helps to educate those of us who are just one step back, right, Alfred? We're not directly in the work, but we are very close in proximity. We have ways that we could support Alfred with regard to our platforms, with regard to our access, right? But we're just one level removed. But that's how I have been able to work with Melanie Campbell, and then to be on the front lines and in the protests, one part as a member of this, Black Women's Roundtable that our civil rights greats really led. Dr. Dorothy Irene Height founded Black Women's Roundtable. It's some of the baddest Black women on the planet. When I tell you they don't play, they here to agitate, and they are not playing about Black people. They are the gatekeepers of the community. And so I thank you for asking the question. I'm really grateful for the topic, because I do think more of us want to know. And how do we get involved? What do we need to do? Whether it's writing letters, is it petitioning? Is it, calling our senator? Is it going to, Capitol Hill? That's why I'm glad for our guest today to break it down a little further. But that's what I just wanted to share about this conversation on voting rights, because we are fighting for our voting rights. And when I tell you this is going to be a sad situation if we don't do something, that is the truth.
There's a couple of things I want to highlight as we bring our guest in. We're talking about engagement on behalf of others, not just ourselves. When we're talking about advocating, the leaders who are advocating for voting rights are often people who are, quote unquote, they're doing fine in their own personal business, financial lives. It's about others that they're serving. And to me, that's a Christ-like mindset. It's not a coincidence that the traditional civil rights groups was rooted in the church back in the day, when we thought we had won these battles 30, 40 years ago. And so I think it's important as we talk about civic engagement and faith, that those two things go together. And I like to say that even when you look at all of the national civil rights organizations, Urban League, NAACP in particular, which is relevant to our guest, there's the 30,000 feet organization, that's the national organization. But the boots on the ground is the local chapters. That's who's doing the engagement.
That's
and
right.
With that, I want to bring in our guest for this conversation, who's head of the Bergen County, New Jersey NAACP, Jeff Carter. Jeff, welcome to the show and to this conversation.
I'm glad to be here with you all, and I look forward to an excellent dialogue and conversation.
Jeff, I just mentioned, because I say this with reverence, I'm a student of Black business history, but Black history in general. Of course, I work for the late Earl Graves Sr., the founder of Black Enterprise, who was very much engaged in the civil rights movement with Dr. King and Coretta Scott King, that he was shaped and molded by that experience. And it's because of that, I really do understand that the work that Dee's talked about, the engagement, the getting people on a local level to understand how this relates to them, happens with the local chapters, happens with the boots on the ground in communities all around the country. Talk a bit about your work and why you do it as head of the Bergen NAACP.
Well, I kind of grew up in the civil rights movement. My father was an Episcopal priest in Pittsburgh, and he was growing up being a Black priest in a white church. You were always fighting for justice and freedom, and a lot of things that he did. The Poor People's March came through and stayed in his church when there were issues with housing. They got the Black contractors together. They bought houses, and we're talking the late 60s, early 70s. They bought the houses, had the Black contractors build them, and then sold them in the community. So I think one of the things we've gotten away from is self-help in the communities. And, we have gotten to a point where we're waiting for other people to do stuff for us. And we need to, do it ourselves. We have a lot of geniuses, a lot of hard workers. And, I think we've gotten to a point lazy and rely on the government to do things. And the government is only as good as we make it.
Listen, we got about a minute left in this segment, so we're going to definitely come back and dive in deeper. I think it's very important that we make the point that I think that it's a point that I think you already touched on. When we're talking about voting rights, when we're talking about power, we're talking about things like housing, like education, like access to resources, like transportation, that there's a direct connection to the quality of people's lives which is why the work that we're doing is so important and why this should matter and does matter to people of faith. Listen, you're listening to Be Lifted Up, your guide to living an abundant life. I'm Alfred Edmonds Jr. with DC Marshall. We're here with our guest, Jeff Carter of the Bergen County NAACP in New Jersey. We'll be right back.